Scott, do you think by addressing climate change you are helping the world?
It's all part and parcel of what is involved. I don't want to get I want to get beyond Copenhagen as being either a salvation or a stick to beat someone up with. About a year and a half ago, I was at had gone down to London for a meeting at one of these high-powered city places that gave me a free lunch but would never employ me as a consultant because they're too high-powered. But it was to talk about risk assessment. And the risk assessment that this firm talked about at a time when we're involved in these wars that we talk about in terms of tires, the major risk that this city firm found, and they advise companies who go all over the world, the major risk they were identifying was resource fluctuations and shortages. And what they just pointed to was that you were seeing food riots, for example, in Bangladesh. You were seeing, in fact, food riots at that point in certain parts of Pakistan. You were seeing questions over water shortages in other places that were causing instability. And those food and water riots in turn were caused because of shifts of pattern, because of climate change. They weren't able to produce as much as they had in the past. Now, that means that you have to, as Roger put it well, recognize that in what is an interconnected world, not only in terms of technology now, but in terms of climate, these ripples will move back and forth if something isn't done. That said, however, and I want to flip it, there is an opportunity. Again, because Russia's been trying to bring optimism. And that is, whereas 50 years ago we were talking about addressing these questions of resource provision and so on by building huge dams like the Aswan Dam in Egypt, for example, or the dam in Ghana. The effort now is to go to smaller community-based projects. For example, a project in South Africa I know about, with a former student of mine, is basically advising on it, which is sustainable housing. And because you're almost building from the ground up and you don't have the infrastructure for a huge power grid, you're looking at trying to save energy and to basically have sustainable in a much different sense than we think about it. If Copenhagen not only addresses that buzz issue we talked about, which is global warming, but it goes beyond that, which it should, to address these questions, then I'll move from being a pessimist to a qualified optimist.
Okay, we'll move on. The gentleman who, yeah, please.
I just want to know, with the climate budget, sometimes like countries get set, they have to cut by 20% or whatever. But there's lots of flaws in that countries have been buying up carbon slots in other countries so that they can then keep on using the electricity to just look good. Would you say that developed countries just have too much power and just sort of get round the energy issue just by like buying up slots in poorer countries?
Aston, we'll start with you, please. Well, carbon trading, I think, was one mechanism that was sort of created really to try and find a market solution to the problems. But we found that, I mean, the problem is that the carbon dioxide emissions are still increasing, basically. So all the mechanisms and things that they try to do to mitigate climate change are actually, if you look at it closely, are actually used for companies just to pollute more and then offload that pollution onto other countries and other smaller companies. So power generation, I think, part of the solution I think is we need a global grid, because if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there's already quite emerging technology, solar technologies, that says we could create huge amounts of solar power in sub-Saharan Africa and Saudi Arabia and countries like this. We could grid it around the world. So power generation, we could, if we with a proper global effort, we could have the power, because it wouldn't just be about wind, it wouldn't just be about sea turbines. I'm sorry, I don't want to be on topic. Your question was addressing carbon credits and whether carbon trading is an appropriate scheme.
I don't think it's an appropriate scheme, no. I don't think it's going to work.
Deirdre, please.
Well, it's a bit like what was all the fashion a few years ago, which was you go on an aeroplane and then you plant a few trees to sort of salve your conscience. And I have to say, I've always thought that's not really a very good idea, because it just suggests that rich people can carry on doing what they want and others can't. So the whole principle, I think, is a bit iffy.
Are there any more comments? Yes, please, down the front.
Yeah, my question also concerns the expectations of Copenhagen. Like you said before, Copenhagen was set up not at the beginning of the process, but actually the end of the process, in which people were expecting the success of the Kyoto Protocol. I'm hearing you right now, no one's really expecting that today, so my question is, what do you think has gone wrong in the going towards, in the coming of Copenhagen? What has gone wrong, and what can we do now to change this trend towards a more positive one?
Again, we'll start with you.
think there's a lot that's going wrong, and partly it's far too far in the future, partly it's a completely different mindset politicians need to adopt. Now, the representatives of the other parties here are sounding wonderful, and I wish they were their leaders, bringing about the things that they're suggesting. But at the minute, the world is desperate for economic growth, which runs completely counter to tackling climate change. And people are desperate to blame everybody else as well. I'm not sure that we're that negative, though, that there may be some steps forwards, but you know Angela Merkel has already said that she's hoping an agreement in 2010. So for her to say that, we can't really expect that something signed in Copenhagen, can we?
What happened, to be simple, I'm a simple guy, is that international cooperation almost broke down between Kyoto and where we are now. And to be blunt and to identify the country in the center of the room, because the Americans trashed Kyoto, politically trashed it, because they were able, they compounded the tragedy of 9/11 by using that as a pretext to walk away from international cooperation. You almost had to try to rebuild the wheel. But I'm going to flip that. The fact is, despite the sabotage of that effort by the Bush administration, and I use that word knowing what it means, they didn't completely break down. There were enough countries that said we have to continue to proceed with this, because there was a point, I don't know if you remember this, when people were talking about Kyoto would go completely. Right? And then countries like Australia flipped and said, no, we're staying in on the process. So no, Copenhagen isn't the end of what we had hoped for, but at least we're having a Copenhagen. And at least we have, again, to be simple, a different American administration. It's still one that in a sense has to be bought off by carbon trade. That's why carbon trade was developed, to buy off the Americans.